It was a quiet afternoon in Savannah, Georgia, when I first felt it, the chill that made my skin crawl. They say the past echoes in places like this, but what I discovered in that old church was something far beyond echoes. It was alive, waiting, and it changed me forever. I had come to Savannah to escape. The city, with its cobblestone streets and Spanish moss, promised a quiet kind of magic, a place where history whispered and time seemed slower. I wasn't looking for ghosts, but in a city like this, they have a way of finding you. It started as a detour. I was wandering down a forgotten road, one that twisted and turned until the quaint houses gave way to empty lots and gnarled trees. The air was heavy, thicker somehow, as if it carried more than just the heat. That's when I saw it. A steeple, barely visible through the tangle of branches. Something about it drew me closer. It wasn't the beauty of it, far from it. The building looked abandoned, its walls streaked with grime and ivy clawing up its sides. One stained glass window remained intact, its colors muted and dull, like the church itself had forgotten what it once stood for. But there was something else, a pull I couldn't explain, like the air around it whispered only to me. I stepped closer, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet echoing too loudly in the stillness. That's when I noticed it. The birds. They perched on the trees surrounding the church, dozens of them, all silent, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I stopped, my skin prickling. A shiver ran down my spine, though the air was stiflingly warm. As I approached, the silence deepened. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made my ears ring. I reached the door, a massive slab of warped wood hanging slightly ajar. The air around it felt colder, pressing against my skin like an unwelcome touch. I hesitated, but something, curiosity, stupidity, urged me to push it open. The door creaked, the sound impossibly loud. Inside, the darkness felt alive. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was thick, oppressive, like it was swallowing every sound, every flicker of movement. I took a step forward, then another. The floorboards groaned beneath me. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall. Not mine, not from the light outside. It was faster, sharper, slithering into the darkness beyond. My breath hitched. The church seemed to hold its breath with me as if waiting. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. The air inside the church was colder than I'd imagined. It clung to my skin, damp and heavy, like walking through a forgotten crypt. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, each creak of the floorboards sending shivers up my spine. The silence wasn't just empty, it felt deliberate, as though something was listening. I didn't see the full expanse of the church at first. The light streaming through the fractured stained glass was faint, casting jagged rainbows across the dust-choked air. The pews were in disarray, some overturned, others missing entirely. Cobwebs stretched between the beams above, swaying lightly in a draft I couldn't feel. I moved deeper, my heart pounding with each hesitant step. That's when I saw the altar. It was barely intact, its wood blackened as though it had survived a fire. Around it lay broken shards of what might have been a cross, scattered like discarded bones. Then, I noticed it. On the floor just before the altar was a book. Its leather cover was warped and cracked, the edges of its pages curling with age. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I knelt to pick it up. The cover bore no title, just a strange symbol etched into the surface, a cross with spiraling lines wrapping around it like vines. When I opened the book, a sickening wave of decay hit me, making my stomach churn. The pages were brittle, some stained a deep, rusty brown. Blood, I realized with a nauseating certainty. But it was the handwriting that unsettled me the most. The words weren't in English, or any language I recognized. They twisted and curled across the pages, looping in impossible patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. Yet somehow, I understood pieces of it. Phrases emerged in my mind unbidden. They come when you call. They wait in the shadows. They hunger. A sudden chill swept through the room, cutting through my clothes like knives. I snapped the book shut and stood, my hands trembling. The shadows in the far corners of the church seemed to shift, as though they were alive. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, when a sound stopped me cold. It wasn't loud, just the faintest shuffle, like bare feet against wood. It came from behind the altar. My breath caught, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal. But my body knew better. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. It echoed back at me, a distorted mockery of itself. And then I saw it. A figure, half hidden in the shadows behind the altar. Its form was indistinct, almost human but wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. It moved, a slow, deliberate tilt of its head, as though it were sizing me up. I stumbled backward, clutching the book to my chest as if it could protect me. The figure didn't move closer, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with a deep, oppressive dread. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the uneven floorboards. The door loomed ahead, my only salvation. As I reached it, the shadows seemed to ripple, closing in from every corner. When I burst outside, the sunlight hit me like a lifeline, warm and blinding. I gulped the air, my chest heaving. Behind me, the church stood silent and unyielding, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. The feeling of being watched didn't leave, even as I walked away. Something in that church had noticed me, and it wasn't done. I should have stayed away. Every rational part of me screamed that going back was a mistake, that whatever I'd encountered in that church wasn't meant to be understood. But something stronger, a pull I couldn't explain, drew me back. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was obsession. The second time I approached the church, the air felt different, heavier than before. The silence was more than an absence of sound. It was a void, swallowing even the rustle of the leaves beneath my feet. The birds were gone, leaving the trees bare and lifeless, as if even they had fled whatever lingered inside. The door was still ajar, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. My heart thundered in my chest as I stepped inside. The light seemed dimmer, the colors of the stained glass muted as though the church itself was darkening. I wasn't alone. It started as a sound, a low rhythmic thudding coming from the far end of the room. I froze, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, like something heavy striking the ground, dragging between steps. Each impact sent vibrations through the floor, reverberating in my chest. "Who's there?" I whispered, though my voice barely carried. The thudding stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing down on me like a weight. My mouth went dry as I took another step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath me. And then, it began again, closer this time. I turned toward the sound and saw it. A figure stood near the altar, shrouded in shadows. Its outline was sharp, yet undefined, like it didn't belong to the physical world. It tilted its head toward me, the movement unnaturally slow, as though mocking my presence. The book. It was holding the book I'd left behind. My legs trembled as I took a step back, but the figure moved in time with me, matching my retreat with deliberate dragging steps. My instincts screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch as it raised a hand, bony, impossibly long fingers curling as though to beckon me closer. "No," I choked, finally finding my voice. "Stay away." The room darkened further, the shadows creeping like ink across the walls. They slithered toward me, silent but alive, coiling around my feet like vines. My breath hitched as I struggled to move, to escape, but the floor beneath me softened, sagging under my weight. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder, overlapping voices hissing words I couldn't understand. My name was among them, spoken with chilling clarity, as though the church itself was calling to me. "Leave me alone," I screamed, tearing my legs free from the grasping shadows. I stumbled backward, my shoulder striking a pew that toppled with a deafening crash. The figure moved faster now, closing the distance between us. Its presence was suffocating, its form growing clearer yet more nightmarish with every step. The hollow sockets where its eyes should have been glowed faintly, burning with a malevolent light that rooted me in place. I turned and bolted, my feet barely finding purchase on the splintering floor. The whispers followed me, growing louder, angrier, until they were a cacophony inside my head. The door was just ahead, the sunlight barely visible through the crack. When I burst outside, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. I turned back toward the church, but the door had swung shut, the building looming silently as if it had never awakened. I knew I couldn't escape it. Something from that place had followed me, not physically, but in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't over, not even close. I couldn't shake the feeling that the church was watching me, even from miles away. The whispers had followed me home, their echo so faint it was almost like a memory, but I knew better. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow sent my heart racing. I had to know what I was dealing with. I started researching. At first, it was just curiosity, but it quickly became an obsession. Late into the night, I pored over old records, scrolling through obscure websites and local history blogs. I found almost nothing about the church. It was like it had been wiped from Savannah's history. Almost. Buried deep in the archives of a forgotten forum, I found a post from years ago. Someone had mentioned a fire that gutted a small church on the outskirts of town in the 1930s. They called it the Hollow Church and claimed it was cursed. No one replied to the post, but it was enough to give me a starting point. The next morning, I visited the local historical society. The woman at the desk smiled warmly as I asked about the church, but the moment I mentioned its location, her face changed. The smile vanished, replaced by a look I couldn't place, fear maybe, or something close to it. "That place isn't in the records," she said, her voice low. "Why not?" I pressed. She glanced around before leaning closer. "It's not something we talk about. If you're smart, you won't either." I didn't stop there. I walked the streets, asking anyone who would listen. Most people ignored me or shook their heads, but eventually I found someone who didn't. An older man sitting on a bench in Forsyth Park stopped me as I passed. "You're asking about the church, aren't you?" His voice was gravelly, tired, like someone who'd carried too much for too long. I nodded, and he sighed, gesturing for me to sit. "People don't like to talk about it," he said, staring into the distance. "They think if they ignore it, it'll go away. But it doesn't. It never does." "What happened there?" I asked, my throat dry. He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "There was a fire. They say the pastor started it himself. People think he went mad. Others say he was trying to stop something that shouldn't have been there in the first place." "Stop what?" The man turned to me, his eyes sharp despite his age. "They called it a curse. Folks who went there, they'd hear things, voices calling their names. Sometimes they'd disappear. Sometimes they'd come back, but they were never the same." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "What about the pastor?" "No one knows for sure. Some say he set the fire to trap whatever was inside. Others say he was the one who let it out." He paused, his gaze boring into mine. "Whatever you're looking for in that place, you won't find answers. Only trouble." I wanted to ask more, but he stood abruptly, shaking his head. "Stay away from it," he said over his shoulder as he walked away. That night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't faint anymore. They were insistent, almost desperate. I couldn't tell if they were pulling me back or warning me away. I lay in bed, clutching the covers as shadows danced on the ceiling. For the first time, I understood what he meant. The church wasn't just a place. It was alive, waiting, and it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't want to go back. I told myself a dozen times that I wouldn't, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They weren't just in my dreams anymore. They were in the quiet moments of my day, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rustle of leaves. Always faint, always there, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The more I resisted, the louder they became. They called my name in a voice that wasn't quite mine, pulling at some part of me I didn't understand. By the third night, I knew there was no use fighting it. I left at dawn. The streets of Savannah were empty, the early light soft and golden. But as I drew closer to the outskirts of town, the air grew colder, heavier. The road to the church felt longer this time, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was gone, swallowed by a sky thick with dark clouds. The church stood ahead, looming and silent. Its presence was wrong, as though the earth itself wanted nothing to do with it. The air felt alive, buzzing with a faint hum that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I stepped inside. The door creaked, the sound echoing in the stillness. The air hit me like a wall, cold and damp, carrying that same metallic tang I remembered. The room looked darker than before, the faint light filtering through the stained glass, casting twisted shapes across the walls. The whispers started almost immediately. This time they were clearer, words I could almost understand, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. My name was among them, spoken with urgency, like a warning or a plea. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The air seemed to shift, the shadows along the walls rippling like water. Something moved in the far corner of the room, a shape too tall, too angular to be human. My pulse quickened as it stepped into the dim light. It wasn't a person. Its body was skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilting at an angle that made my stomach churn. Hollow eyes burned with a faint, sickly glow, locking onto mine as if it had been waiting for me. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of a pew. The thing moved closer, its movements jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening roar. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice was barely audible over the noise. It didn't stop. The temperature plummeted, my breath fogging in front of me. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to reach for the flashlight in my pocket. The beam flickered to life, cutting through the darkness. For a moment, the thing stopped, its hollow eyes narrowing against the light. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then it lunged. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as I scrambled to my feet. The shadows around me twisted, stretching across the floor like hands reaching for my ankles. I ran blindly, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the air grew heavier with every step. The whispers changed, becoming a singular voice that echoed inside my skull. "You don't belong here." I didn't know where I was going. The layout of the church no longer made sense. Doors that should have led outside opened into empty rooms, hallways stretched endlessly, and the light from the stained glass seemed to follow me, casting distorted shapes on the walls. I turned a corner and froze. The altar was in front of me, though I was sure I'd been running in the opposite direction. The book was there again, open and glowing faintly with a pulsing red light. The whispers became screams, a chorus of agony and rage that made my knees buckle. The figure was behind the altar now, its skeletal hands resting on the book. Its head tilted again, a slow, deliberate motion that made my skin crawl. "You called us," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The voice echoed around me, inside me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I didn't," but I had. The realization hit me like a blow. By opening that book, by stepping inside this place, I had invited something in. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. The shadows on the walls stretched toward me, wrapping around my arms, my legs, holding me in place. My chest tightened as the air grew thinner, colder. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was its face inches from mine, its hollow eyes burning into my soul. When I woke up, I was outside. The church loomed behind me, silent and still. But something was different. I wasn't alone anymore. Whatever was inside that church had followed me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the darkness of the room pressing down on me. The air felt wrong, too heavy, too still. My first thought was that I had dreamed the entire thing, that the church, the figure, the voices were all figments of an overactive imagination. But then I saw the book. It was there on my bedside table, the cracked leather cover illuminated faintly by the streetlight filtering through my blinds. I hadn't brought it back. I hadn't touched it since leaving the church. My pulse quickened as I reached out, fingers trembling, to confirm what my eyes couldn't believe. Before I could touch it, the pages fluttered open, though there was no breeze. A low, guttural hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls, the bed, my chest. I stumbled back, hitting the wall as the room began to spin. The words on the page glowed faintly red, shifting and twisting like they were alive. "You called us," a voice hissed, low and guttural. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow in the corner of the room began to move, stretching and growing until it towered over me. It was the figure from the church, its skeletal limbs contorting unnaturally, its hollow eyes burning with that same sickly glow. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body felt frozen, pinned by an unseen force. The figure moved closer, the hum growing louder, almost deafening. "We are bound to you," it said, its voice like nails on glass. "You opened the door. Now you must see." Before I could process the words, the room shifted around me. My walls melted into darkness, the bed disintegrated beneath me, and I fell. The fall felt endless, the air rushing past me cold and damp, carrying whispers that echoed my name. When I landed, the ground beneath me was soft, wet, and pulsing like it was alive. I stood, my knees shaking, and realized I was back in the church. But it wasn't the same. The pews were gone, replaced by a vast open space illuminated by a blood-red glow. The walls writhed with shadowy shapes, faces and limbs pressing against the surface as if trying to escape. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay, choking me with every breath. In the center of the room stood the altar. It was surrounded by a circle of burned, crumbling objects, candles, bones, and pieces of what looked like human hair. The book lay open on the altar, its pages turning on their own, faster and faster, the red glow intensifying with each flip. The figure was there, its body larger now, grotesque and malformed. It reached out, its long fingers curling toward the book. "You must see," it said again, its voice booming in my skull. Before I could move, the ground beneath me erupted, tendrils of shadow wrapping around my legs and pulling me forward. I clawed at the floor, but it was no use. The tendrils dragged me closer to the altar, closer to the figure, closer to the book. When I was inches away, the figure reached out and placed its hand on my chest. A searing pain shot through me, and my vision blurred. The world shifted again, and I was no longer in the church. I was standing in a room filled with fire. Screams echoed around me, raw and primal, as figures ran in every direction. I recognized the room. It was the church, but it was whole, untouched by time. The flames consumed everything, the heat blistering my skin. In the center of the chaos stood the pastor. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with terror. He held the book in his hands, chanting words that made my ears bleed. Around him were the townspeople, their faces twisted in rage as they closed in on him. "You did this," one of them screamed, pointing a finger at him. "No," the pastor cried, holding the book high. "I'm trying to stop it." But it was too late. The shadows emerged from the fire, engulfing the townspeople, their screams fading into silence. The pastor dropped the book, falling to his knees as the shadows consumed him too. The vision faded, and I was back in the church, gasping for air. "You see now," the figure said, its voice softer but no less chilling. "The book binds us all. What do you want from me?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "You opened the door," it said. "Now you must close it." Before I could respond, the book snapped shut, and the glow vanished. The shadows retreated, and I was left alone in the silence of the church, but I knew it wasn't over. The whispers were gone, but their weight remained. The figure's words echoed in my mind. I had opened the door. Now it was my responsibility to close it. The moment the book shut, the silence in the church was deafening, as if the building itself were holding its breath. My chest heaved, every inhale burning as though the air were laced with smoke. My legs felt weak, shaking beneath me, but I forced myself to stand. I couldn't stay here. Not another second. The figure was gone, or at least I thought it was. The red glow had vanished, leaving the church shrouded in darkness, the only light filtering faintly through the fractured stained glass windows. But the oppressive weight of the place remained, pressing down on my chest like an unseen hand. I took a step toward the door, each movement slow and deliberate, as though my body feared waking the shadows again. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. I kept my eyes forward, afraid to look back, afraid of what I might see if I did. Then, from somewhere deep within the church, a low, guttural growl echoed, reverberating through the walls and vibrating in my bones. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint at first, like a distant storm, but it grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was all around me. "Run." The word slammed into my mind with such force it almost felt like someone had shouted it. My body obeyed before my brain could process, my feet pounding against the rotting wood as I sprinted toward the door. The church wasn't letting me go. The walls seemed to shift, the door stretching farther away with every step I took. The whispers were back, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices screaming and hissing in languages I didn't understand. Shadows spilled from the corners, writhing like living things, reaching out with clawed hands to grasp at my legs. "Leave me alone," I screamed, swatting at the air, my voice cracking with desperation. The door was just ahead now, close enough to touch. I lunged forward, my fingers scraping against the cold wood. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pulled it open and tumbled outside. The air hit me like a wave, sharp and cold, filling my lungs in ragged gasps. I collapsed onto the gravel, my hands trembling as I clawed at the ground, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. But the church wasn't done with me. Behind me, the growl turned into a roar, a sound so guttural and deep, it felt as though the earth itself was splitting open. I turned just in time to see the shadows pour out of the door like black smoke, twisting and writhing as they reached for me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my legs screaming with pain as I stumbled through the overgrown brush. The world around me felt warped, the trees stretching impossibly tall, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step, until they were all I could hear. My vision blurred with tears, the edges of my world narrowing into a single point of focus. Escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke free of the trees and stumbled onto the road. The whispers stopped. The air was still. I turned back toward the church, expecting to see it looming in the distance, but it was gone. The clearing where it had stood was empty, the trees surrounding it swaying gently in the breeze as though nothing had ever been there. But I knew better. The days that followed were a blur. I barely left my apartment, keeping the windows shut tight and the lights on at all hours. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, those hollow eyes burning into my soul. The whispers didn't leave. They were quieter now, but they were there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows move in the corners of my vision, twisting and curling like they had in the church. I wasn't alone. The book was gone. I hadn't brought it with me, and yet I felt its presence everywhere. It wasn't just an object. It was a tether, binding me to whatever had been in that church. I tried to move on, to convince myself it was over, but the signs were everywhere. The lights in my apartment flickered constantly, even after I replaced the bulbs. Objects shifted when I wasn't looking. A chair moved a few inches. A picture frame turned to face the wall. The nightmares were the worst. Every night I found myself back in the church standing before the altar. The figure was always there, its skeletal frame looming over me, its hollow eyes boring into mine. It didn't speak anymore. It didn't need to. The whispers did the talking, repeating the same phrase over and over. You open the door. You must close it. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to know. Weeks passed, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The nightmares became more vivid, leaving me drenched in sweat and gasping for air. I felt myself unraveling, losing pieces of who I was. One night, I woke to find myself standing in my living room, the door to my apartment wide open. I didn't remember getting out of bed. I didn't remember unlocking the door. That was when I knew. The church wasn't done with me. It had let me leave, but it hadn't let me go. Whatever I had unleashed, whatever I had seen, it was still with me, waiting, watching. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. Years later, I found myself back in Savannah. I hadn't planned to return. God knows I'd tried to leave that chapter of my life buried. But life has a strange way of drawing you back to the places you least want to go. Savannah had always held a certain magic for me, even after everything that happened. Yet, as I walked those cobblestone streets, the memories I'd fought to suppress began creeping back, stronger than ever. It was the whispers that did it. They weren't as loud as before, just faint murmurs brushing the edges of my mind. But they were unmistakable. I thought I'd left them behind, but some things never truly let go. I ignored them at first, hoping they'd fade as they had on occasion over the years. Instead, they grew stronger, leading me to the outskirts of town before I even realized where my feet were taking me. The road was the same, winding and overgrown, the trees gnarled and ancient as if time hadn't touched them. But something was different. The air, once so heavy and oppressive, felt strangely light. The cold that used to cling to my skin was gone, replaced by the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves. When I reached the clearing, my heart sank. The church was gone. Where the decaying structure had once stood was an empty patch of land, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. The trees that had once formed a dense, foreboding barrier around it now stood at ease, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I stepped into the clearing, half expecting the earth to shift beneath me or the shadows to rise up and swallow me whole. But nothing happened. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It was like the church had never been there. For a moment I thought I might be free. Perhaps I had imagined it all. An overactive mind crafting horrors from whispers and shadows. But then I saw it. In the center of the clearing, nestled among the wildflowers, was a single object. The book. Its cracked leather cover was unmistakable, the strange symbol etched into its surface as vivid as the day I'd first seen it. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my hands trembling at my sides. It shouldn't have been there. I had left it behind. I had tried to escape it. And yet there it was, waiting for me. I knelt down, my fingers hovering just above the surface. The air around it felt cold, impossibly so, and the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of voices. My name was among them, spoken over and over again. You opened the door. You must close it. No, I whispered, shaking my head. Not again. But deep down, I knew the truth. The church hadn't vanished. It had simply moved, slipping back into the cracks between worlds, waiting for someone else to find it. And the book? The book was its anchor, a tether to this world, drawing in those foolish enough to listen. I stood, backing away from it, my pulse pounding in my ears. The clearing felt darker now, the warmth of the sun gone. The shadows stretched longer, creeping closer. I turned and ran. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped and looked back one last time. The book sat untouched, bathed in a faint red glow that wasn't there before. I don't know who will find it next. Maybe someone like me, someone curious and desperate for answers. Or maybe it will find someone stronger, someone who can do what I couldn't. But one thing is certain, the church isn't gone. It never will be. It's waiting, just like it waited for me. If you've ever felt the pull of the unknown, I want to hear your story. Have you encountered a place that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation? Share your ghost stories or experiences with the supernatural in the comments below. And if this tale left you with chills, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more unsettling journeys into the mysterious and the macabre. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll never miss our next dive into the unknown. Who knows? Your story could inspire our next haunting adventure. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some doors are best left closed.